minor nation, and tonight we are going to be having a guest speaker from the State Historical Society of Missouri. But first, I'm going to go through and tell you what our upcoming events are. Next Tuesday, same time, same place, we'll have Dr. Larry Gregg discussing the desegregation and progress towards integration of Missouri S&T. And the following Tuesday, on the 28th, we will have longtime professor Dr. Harvest Collier. And he's going to discuss his experience of faculty integration at Missouri S&T. And he was here for 30 years, so I'm sure he's got a lot to talk about. We do have display cases all around the room, over here and across here, that cover both integration on this campus and around the state. So feel free to take a look at those after the talk. And now, Katie Seal from the State Historical Society will introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Debbie. So tonight I get the honor of introducing Dr. Gary Kremer. So he is the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri and has been for the last 21 years. This is kind of, I guess, his last hurrah. He'll be retiring and sadly leaving us, but I think going on to hopefully many fun projects and a little bit more relaxation after that. Gary's also previously taught at Lincoln University and William Woods University, and then also spent several years serving as the state archivist for the state of Missouri. He's the author and co-author of numerous books, including Race and Meaning, The African American Experience in Missouri, This Place of Promise, A Historian's Perspective on 200 Years of Missouri History, and George Washington Carver, A Biography, among many more. So please join me in welcoming Gary as he discusses the reality of desegregation in public education in the state of Missouri.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Larry Gregg, for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to talk about desegregation of Missouri's public schools tonight. With the Brown versus Board of Education case sitting on the Supreme Court's docket in January 1954, Lincoln University professor and civil rights activist and one of my teachers, J. Errol Miller, declared, quote, "Regardless of how these cases are decided, Negroes are bound to benefit," end quote. He, like many other African Americans and civil rights activists, hoped for the best, but they also anticipated a much more muted victory. The resulting complete victory on May 17, 1954, was a day of rejoicing for many Black Americans and their white allies. On that day, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously decreed that segregation in public schools was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and therefore unconstitutional. Speaking for the full court, Chief Justice Earl Warren said in part that to separate Black children, quote, "from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to be undone," end quote. He continued then, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." This famous case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, took its name from Linda Carroll Brown, whose father, the Reverend Oliver Brown, challenged the constitutionality of the Kansas law that separated white and Black students into separate schools. Brown had become tired of seeing his daughter denied access to a nearby white school simply because of her race. The result was perhaps the most important decision handed down by the Supreme Court of the United States in the 20th century. Many Black Americans hailed the decision as the dawn of a new era. But the Brown decision also generated anxiety among many, even in the Black community. How would white teachers and students respond to the influx of Black students into their previously all-white schools? What would happen to the many black teachers and administrators who had taught in the previously all-black schools? Indeed, what would happen to the black schools themselves? And what would happen to all the black institutions, organizations, and businesses that had emerged over the years of Jim Crow and that had sustained African Americans and served the needs of their racially segregated communities? Would integration diminish or even destroy them all? These questions remained relevant for decades, I would argue even today, as the United States and Missouri work their way through the implications of Brown versus Board of Education. The Brown decision caused mixed reactions throughout the nation. It brought forth angry responses from many pro-segregation politicians and citizens in the Deep South. Elsewhere, there was less overt resistance, at least initially, to the court's decision. In the northern and border states, many white Americans joined with African Americans in praising the decision. The single as head of the Metropolitan Federation's Commission on Racial and Intercultural Relations, the Reverend Ralph Abel, rejoiced that, quote, the social law is catching up with the moral law, end quote. He noted that the court's decision was, quote, a heaven-sent opportunity to engender and demonstrate the goodwill necessary to bring about practical integration as soon as possible. Students at Stowe Teachers College, an all-black school in St. Louis, shared their reactions in the days following the decision. A student named David Cunningham declared, quote, I think it was a wise decision due to the position the United States holds in the world today. It will improve conditions in the United States as a whole. Another student, Betty Holloway, remarked, quote, it should have happened a long time ago. Since it did happen, integration will be beneficial to both groups. Yet another student responded, it's a wonderful thing. I hope it doesn't take long before the schools in St. Louis are integrated. It will lead to more competition for both groups. And yet another student was less sure about what would actually happen. She commented, I favor the decision, but I'm somewhat skeptical of the results. I feel that in the northern and western states, it can be carried out without much difficulty. But in the southern states, it will create a great problem. Allen was right that it would not be an easy change in most of the South. And we all know the story of Little Rock Nine and others. Vicious and sustained public outcries from white writers, politicians, and parents, laws passed attempting to negate the court's ruling, plans to avoid compliance, to say nothing of the protests and terrorist attacks that followed in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, all contributed to a deep sense of tension in the nation. However, while other states protested and planned ways to avoid the ruling, in Missouri, most reporters and editors and activists cautiously praised the decision, or simply reported the news without attempting to stir up white resentment. Missouri's governor, Phil Donnelly from Lebanon, point blank refused to attend a conference of Southern governors who were opposed to school desegregation, instead declaring he favored the measure. The State Commissioner of Education of Missouri asked the United States Attorney General what effect the Brown case would have on the state's racially segregated schools, mostly in order to determine the timeline by which the schools should be desegregated in Missouri. In June 1954, the Attorney General of the United States responded that Missouri's school segregation laws were immediately null and void, and integration, as the Supreme Court ordered the next year, must proceed, quote, with all deliberate speed. In the Eisenhower administration, there was broad support for desegregation of schools, which some in the administration thought would lead to broader social integration. The lack of overt resistance to desegregation in most of Missouri led the National Office of the NAACP in April of 1955. They produced a pamphlet titled, It Can Be Done, and they said of Missouri, quote, Of the 17 southern and border states, Missouri is out front. You don't hear that often. In regard to desegregation, other publications too offered applause. George Brantley wrote in the Journal of Negro Education in 1955 that Missouri had, quote, changed from the show me state to the show you state in its statewide program of desegregation. Time magazine gave Missouri an A for its desegregation efforts in that same year. Some districts had planned ahead. In St. Louis, there had been work going on for years preparing for integration, largely because the Catholic schools in St. Louis had begun integrating in the 1940s and 50s, largely because, as St. Louis' William Selman stated, quote, we knew it was coming. We knew we had to be prepared. Elsewhere, when the Rolla Daily News publisher, Edward Sowers, was asked by KMOX TV news anchor Spencer Allen in 1958 if there had been any problems with integration in Rolla, Sowers promptly responded, no, Rolla schools were already integrated before the Supreme Court decision. We don't have a problem. That wasn't true, by the way. In some ways, Sowers may have been correct, although in 1954, Rolla's Lincoln School for Negro Students still had 9 black students here, and there were 3 black high school students who were being bused to the high school at Lincoln University in Jefferson City. The Rolla Board of Education voted on June 7th, 1954 to close the Lincoln School. Black students were integrated into the existing white schools, and the board considered using the Lincoln building as a kindergarten before they ultimately sold it to the Community of Christ in 1960. Many other communities appeared to quickly integrate as well. However, although Missouri generally escaped the determined and violent opposition to integration later that year, and that occurred in many parts of the South, the process in Missouri was not without its difficulties, which were at times overlooked by many white Missourians. The opposition to integration came from both members of the white and black communities. Some of the black community voiced hesitation over forced integration. In many places under Jim Crow policies, especially in Kansas City and St. Louis, black Missourians formed what the NAACP called, quote, little kingdoms, end quote, in response to racial segregationist policies that excluded them from the white mainstream. Of the states that mandated segregated schools, Missouri had been one of the few that had tried to spend relatively equal amounts per capita on school children regardless of skin color, which allowed some black communities, especially in the urban areas, to hire quality teachers, create solid infrastructure, and create good teaching materials. The Brown decision, they feared, would force black children to endure the hardships associated with integration, hateful behavior from the white community, a traumatic change in environment, and for some, the potential of losing the cultural and communal heritage they had worked so hard to build. The benefits did not seem to them to outweigh the costs. Indeed, in St. Louis, the initial response to the Brown decision helps us, I think, understand the diversity and complexity of opinion within the black community. Authors Judge Gerald Haney and Dr. Susan Uchittle write that the city welcomed Brown with, quote, enthusiasm and hope, and quickly moved to implement integration. Several groups in St. Louis, including the League of Women Voters, the Metropolitan Church Federation, and the St. Louis Diocese of the Catholic Church, as well as many members of the local press, celebrated the impending change. Researcher Jessica McCulley, though, shows how the local branch of the NAACP partnered with the St. Louis Argus, a leading black newspaper in St. Louis, to campaign for integration in the early 1950s because they believed a group of black teachers in St. Louis were organizing opposition to integration over concerns about keeping their jobs. A previous effort in Missouri to integrate the schools prior to Brown versus Board of Education had stalled in the state Senate, with rumors swirling that black teachers had been some of the most effective lobbyists who helped stall the bill despite support from the House and the governor. The NAACP, via the Argus and the St. Louis American, shamed this group and asserted that the teachers' assumption that integrated education would signal an end to black teaching jobs. They shamed them into trying to make them understand that that was not true, and it was misguided. The NAACP was correct about most black St. Louis teaching jobs, but unfortunately they were wrong about the results in the rest of the state. Missouri's Commissioner of Education believed that the fate of the some 2,000 black teachers in the state in black schools was not a concern of the State Board of Education. Rather, he said it should be left to local boards to decide what happened with those teachers' jobs. The numbers show the results. Over half of Kansas City's black teachers lost their jobs. Springfield hired one black teacher in 1955. In Malden, Potosi, Lexington, Jefferson City, Clinton, Henrietta, and other communities, 125 to 150 black teachers lost their jobs. One scholar estimates that from 1954 to 1970, black educators in the state lost more than $18 million in what he referred to as post-integration displacement, resulting from Missouri schools' response to the Brown decision. A 2025 report on black teachers in Missouri who lost their jobs in the wake of Brown v. Board of Education indicates that, quote, this report just came out in the last few days, over 2,230 black educators were removed from classrooms across the state during integration in Missouri. In the Randolph County town of Moberly, the local school board closed the all-black Lincoln School in 1955. The board refused to hire any of the Lincoln School's black teachers to teach in the newly integrated Moberly schools, despite the fact that additional white teachers were hired and that many of the black teachers had more formal training than the white teachers. Led by teacher Naomi Brooks, the black teachers sued the school superintendent and the board for $32,000 in federal district court in St. Louis. Their lead attorney was the prominent NAACP lawyer, Robert Carter, who had been the lead counsel in Brown v. Board of Education. Subsequently, Superintendent Henderson argued that hiring black teachers would have meant firing white teachers, quote, and he didn't see any justification for that, end quote. The black teachers lost their case in federal court in a decision rendered by Judge Roy Harper in June 1958. They subsequently appealed the decision to the 8th District Circuit Court of Appeals, where they lost, and they appealed that case to the United States Supreme Court, which refused to hear the case. According to a 2024 newspaper article about this case, Superintendent Henderson also cited, quote, intangible factors, end quote, as reasons no black teachers were hired after integration. For example, quote, he said that teacher Lotus Harris had a bad attitude. For many black students, the Brown decision and the changes it portended were frightening. In a 1989 interview with historian Lori Bogle, Betty Robinson of Joplin recalled how she felt in the mid-1950s when she was suddenly transferred from an all-black school to a predominantly white one. She remembered that she was, quote, anxious, scared, not happy. There might have been some people happy, she said, but at Lincoln School, we were not happy. Because when you live in a racist society, you learn your place. We didn't know what to expect, and we did not expect acceptance. In fact, we expected rejection. Students in Columbia also shared their experiences. The Columbia School District officially ended segregation in the week following the Brown decision, though only a few black students chose to enroll in Hickman High School. They didn't integrate the elementary school right away. I think there were initially only 2 black students and then a few more who chose to leave the all-black Douglas School, which stayed open until 1960. Eventually, with enrollment at Douglas falling each year, the district closed the school in 1960 and its students enrolled in formerly all-white schools. In a 2013 article in the Columbia Missourian, several former Douglas students recalled their mixed emotions about their integration experiences. Madeline Raleigh, who enrolled in Jefferson Junior High School at 13, endured racial slurs and hostility. Teresa Langford began her 3rd grade year at Benton Elementary, where she remembered that she and her fellow African American students were confronted by bullies on the school bus, but that, she said, we held our own. Many of those who were at the end of their secondary education transferred to Hickman High School, where their Douglas traditions and comfort were lost in the transition. At Douglas, Barbara Harrell explained to the paper, quote, we had band, we had chorus, we had honor society, you name it, we had it. The security that they felt at Douglas did not make the transfer to the newly integrated buildings. The historical record shows us that integration was not as easy, was not an easy process in many places in Missouri. When the Union School Board in Franklin County pressed forward with its plans to integrate in schools in the fall of 1955, white parents organized a petition stating that they would not send their children to school with black children and asserted that most parents, black and white, wanted segregated schools. At the September board meeting, though, several others spoke out in support of integration. Ross Henson, one of only 2 black men at the meeting, told the board that, quote, he was 100% in favor of integration. A guidance counselor told the board that he taught, quote, human beings, regardless of the color of their skin. Importantly, in defense of their decision to integrate union schools, 2 board members framed their support of integration around geopolitics, the era of McCarthy and the Cold War, and the reputation of the United States abroad, saying, quote, we cannot go on the voice of America behind the Iron Curtain and plead our case when we are violating some of the essences right in our own backyard. Another said that America's past, another echoed that Americans' past made it so we're going to be in the doghouse in the world if we don't integrate. A world in which about 1/4 of the people are white. In the name of Christianity, we cannot support segregation, end quote. Farther south in the Boot Hill, the process was even more contentious. In Clarkton, about 20 miles north of Kennett in Dunklin County, the district ended its first attempt at integration after 1 week in August of 1954. 12 black students enrolled and attended classes in Clarkton until rumors swirled of violence between black and white students. Though the school board found the reports to be groundless, 250 white parents showed up at the school board meeting to protest the admission of black children in Clarkton schools. The board caved and the children were transported to an all-black school in Malden for the rest of that school year. 3 years later, the school board decided the district could no longer spend public funds on transporting those black kids to Malden. And as a result, the board agreed that if the Clarkton public could secure the $3,000 to pay the transportation costs, they would continue to segregate. But if they weren't willing to put up the $3,000, they would have to integrate. Nobody came up with any money, and the Clarkton schools were forced to integrate. The Clarkton News ran a banner that read, vote integration unless $3,000 is raised. Need money to send 13 to Malden, end quote. And again, the money was not raised, and the students integrated the school. In 1956, the Maryville Daily Forum ran the headline, no integration problems in southern Missouri. Poplar Bluff integrated one of its elementaries with 4 black students. The high school remained segregated due to, quote, overcrowding issues, end quote. Sykeston was in its 2nd year of integration with 22 black high school students. Kennett High School reported 15 black students in the high school, and that Malden integrated in 1955. The Daily Forum article noted that Pemiscot County schools were still segregated, though the Charleston School Board voted to integrate its schools in 1955. Soon after, 128 white people signed a resolution asking the board to reverse its decision. The Dunklin Democrat reported that a school board member, Quentin Banta, had watermelons thrown at his vehicle, and T.J. Brown, the school board president, had a cross burned on his yard. After years of advocacy and litigation, Charleston finally integrated its school in the mid-1960s. Even though most Missouri school districts were legally desegregated by the 1960s, most black students were still attending all-black schools, in part due to the geographic concentration of black Missourians in St. Louis and Kansas City, where 90% of the black school-aged children lived. Integration of the school district meant little if the district itself was virtually all black. For example, the Clayton School District in suburban St. Louis declared that it had, quote, fully integrated with 2% black enrollment. Eureka, too, concluded that its integration efforts in the 1950s succeeded with black students making up 2% of its student body, even though it still ran all white and all black schools in the mid-1950s. One way to address this form of segregation was to bus students from one district to another, but difficulties only multiplied when school districts began busing students to achieve racial integration. The process that occurred in St. Louis illustrates the problem. During the school year 1961-62, the St. Louis School Board decided that to bus pupils from predominantly or all black schools to 20 white schools, almost 90% of the bused pupils were black. In a practice that came to be called intact busing, the students were bused as entire classes rather than as individuals. So classrooms remained segregated even though a school building might be integrated. Indeed, many of the transported students had no contact with pupils who lived in the receiving districts. In many of these schools, blacks and whites ate at different times and were restricted to different separate parts of the playground. They didn't see each other. In 1961 and 62, some 4,600 black students were transported from the overcrowded schools of St. Louis's West End. The following school year, approximately 6,000 black students were bused. However, the segregated housing situation nullified any real efforts at successful integration. By 1965, 91% of the black elementary school children in St. Louis attended all black or predominantly black schools. In 1966, nearly 40% of Missouri's black school children were in schools that were at least 95% black, and 35% of the black pupils were in all black schools. Busing was also part of the integration plan in St. Joseph, which is one of the few places it seems to have worked. Alonzo Weston, writing for the St. Joseph News Press in 2013, remembered how many friendships were formed when, quote, white kids came from all over, end quote, to the formerly all-black Bartlett High School, which was renamed Horace Mann, or Weston attending reunions for the Bartlett Horace Mann School and watching his former classmates, both black and white, reminisce and enjoy a lifelong bond is a, quote, testament to how smooth integration went in St. Joseph. That was the exception. In 1974, the Missouri Human Rights Commission completed a study titled Integration in Missouri Public Schools. Statistically, 90 of the 227 districts in the state did not enroll any black students, and 160 of them did not employ any black teachers. St. Louis had 55 all-black schools in 1972, 22 of which had all-black staff. The report went on to state that 72% of the schools in St. Louis and 63% of those in Kansas City had student bodies with 95% or more of one race. Thus, the report showed that throughout the state, faculties and students remained segregated, even though nominally legal segregation no longer existed. Many in the black community, nearly 2 decades after the Brown decision, still voiced concern that desegregation only meant the shutting down of black schools and the dismissal of black teachers. For example, when the Hayti R2 district in the Boot Hill of the state closed its all-black school, the district lost 35 black teachers and gained 13 white teachers from 1967 to 72. This translated to a drop from 53.1% of black faculty in Hayti to 22% black. In Charleston, also in the Boot Hill, the school claimed it tried to hire a black counselor for 5 years, but couldn't find a suitable applicant. Missouri's metropolitan areas, of course, fared differently. Kansas City's district number 33 gained 106 black teachers over those 5 years, even though the district shrunk its employment by over 600 teachers, though the report did cite friction between faculty of different races. St. Louis City's percentage of black faculty held steady between the late 1960s and early 70s. By the mid-70s, over half the school administrators in St. Louis were black. Within the school buildings, the 1974 report charged, segregation was maintained by class assignments, and black pupils faced unfair and unequal disciplinary policies, which seemed aimed at forcing them to drop out of school. Specifically, parents in the Bujo district of Hayti and New Madrid charged the school with suspending black students, especially males, at a higher and more harsh rate. Parents also thought their children were, quote, being stuck away in special education and never getting out, end quote, and that the white community rejected integration by hosting private events for white students only. PTA organizations stopped meeting during the integration period, leaving one administrator to suggest that white parents did not want to associate with black parents. Really. The black educational experience in the Boot Heel, though, was not completely bound by these negatives. Every now and then there's that glitter of hope. 1974's valedictorian and salutatorian in Hayti were black, and the Sikeston R6 district coordinated parent-teachers conferences and elected a black president of the PTA. The report offered the following anecdote to show Sikeston's progress. Quote, a black elementary physical ed teacher was hired last year. Most of the white parents didn't know that the gentleman was black until the first open house was held. It had not occurred to the children, the students, to even mention his color, end quote. Busing remained a controversial remedy to segregation. The 1974 Human Rights Commission report documented one mother's apprehension about her son being bused from the inner city to a white suburban school. She relayed that her son, quote, faced almost overwhelming social adjustments, switching back and forth between the white school and the black ghetto, end quote, and felt rejection from both places. That reminds me, a number of years ago, I interviewed a man, I think he's still alive, in St. Louis. He grew up in Jefferson City. His father taught at Lincoln University, Sidney Reed III. Because his father was one of the few black Catholics, he went to Catholic school. And he had to walk up Dunklin Street by Lincoln and then walk over east to the Catholic school. So he said the black kids would beat him up on the way up the street because he was going to a white school, and the white kids would beat him up because he was black. And so many days he just hid out all day. You know, he just didn't go to school. Black parents, the report stated, the 1974 report, thought token integration hurt the students who were removed from their local schools. The report noted the frustration of parents in Kansas City as it confronted, quote, a black population that is simply tired of being patient, end quote. Some within the black community devoted their time to creating programs that promoted awareness of black culture in schools. The Urban Rural Community Council and organization developed a week-long program called Spectrum in Black, held at Vashon High School in St. Louis in the spring of 1974. Each day, students attended sessions with college professors, community leaders, and politicians, such as Congressman William Clay Sr., and then participated in entertainment workshops. They listened to music from Black Ivory and the Midnight News Band, and they watched plays by Lincoln University students about, among other things, the life of Malcolm X. But even with these initiatives, black community leaders struggled with the educational progress of black youth. Ernie McMillan, president of Proud magazine in St. Louis, published in the 1970s, reflected on the publication's annual education issue over the first half of the decade in the 70s. Quote, the open hostility and enraged frustration is there in the 1970 issue. The student militancy in 71, the cry for unity and understanding among black people in 72 and 73, and now in 1974, the apparent lack of direction, striking out in all directions, the confusion of our times, end quote. In 1978, the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education completed a survey of urban metropolitan education in the state. Sadly, little had changed in 5 years. More than 90% of the minority students still attended schools in minority school districts, and the staff composition of the school districts generally reflected the district's racial makeup. In short, nearly all the black students and staff were located in largely black school districts. In addition, the dropout rate was highest in the two largest minority school districts, St. Louis and Kansas City. Minority school districts generally received the least amount of money per pupil when state and local funding was counted, although the amount did vary from district to district. Perhaps most frustrating was the Department of Education's prediction that Missouri urban schools would become increasingly segregated in the 1980s. During the 1980s, African Americans in Missouri, like African Americans elsewhere in the country, continued to believe that education was a key to upward social and economic mobility. Their hopes were nurtured during those years by the federal courts, especially in the wake of a key Supreme Court case, Green versus New Kent County in Virginia, which forced districts to ensure desegregation plans actually produced integrated schools. In the city of St. Louis, the court's involvement in local public education really began in the early 1970s. In 1972, a group of black Northside parents, led by a woman named Minnie Liddell, sued the St. Louis City Board of Education, alleging that the city's school system was racially segregated and in violation of the U.S. Constitution. Ms. Liddell's story is worth retelling. In 1971, she lived with her husband and 5 children in North St. Louis. The schools in the family's neighborhood were overcrowded, so her eldest son, along with his entire class and black teacher, were transferred as part of the intact busing program to an all-white school in South St. Louis. When news came that new schools would be constructed within walking distance of her home, she was elated. That is, until more overcrowding led to the district reassigning her children away from their newly created nearby school to a building that had been closed due to its deteriorating condition. Minnie Liddell took her frustration to her neighbors, and the result was the formation of a group called Concerned Parents, who, after exhaustive research, exposed the St. Louis School Board's pattern of opening and closing schools for black children and the racially charged redrawing of attendance areas in violation of the 14th Amendment. In October 1973, senior U.S. District Judge James Meredith ruled that the suit could proceed as a class action suit. And you all probably remember this. Several years of maneuvering on each side followed. In 1977, the U.S. Department of Justice entered the case on the side of the plaintiffs, and 2 parent groups joined the defendants. Subsequently, the State Board of Education and the State Commissioner of Education were added as defendants. The case finally went to trial in October 1977, and over the course of the next 7 months, 39 witnesses testified, resulting in a transcript of more than 70,000 pages, the records of which are at the State Historical Society. On February 2nd, 1979, Judge Meredith heard final arguments in the case. On April 12th, he ruled in favor of the defendants and against the black parents, the NAACP and the Justice Department. Undaunted, the NAACP appealed the case to the U.S. Court of Appeals of the 8th Circuit. In January of 1980, the Court of Appeals heard the arguments, and by March, the 7-member Court of Appeals ruled in a unanimous opinion that, quote, voluntary techniques will not effectively desegregate the St. Louis school system. The city school board would no longer be allowed to continue integrating city schools on a voluntary basis. And later that same year, Judge Meredith named a desegregation planning committee chaired by Dean Edward Foote of Washington University's Law School. Meetings, discussions, modifications to the plan followed until Meredith approved it in May. Meredith laid the bulk of the blame for segregated schools in Missouri on the state of Missouri and its officials, thereby laying the groundwork for using state funds to remedy the situation. Subsequently, Judge William Hungate replaced the physically ailing Meredith and proceeded to order the state to pay more than $3 million for desegregation programs in St. Louis. As a result of the 1983 agreement, St. Louis had a voluntary interdistrict choice program known as VIC that brought thousands of students from the city to attend county schools and gave county students the opportunity to attend magnet schools in the city. In 1999, a new settlement began the program's wind down. Extensions continued until 2024 and 2025, when the VIC program officially ended. The story across the state in Kansas City is very similar. When the Brown decision came down in 1954, students were nervous about the prospects of attending integrated schools. Bradley Who's conducted oral histories with students at Central High in 2014 as part of his dissertation work at UMKC. One of his interviewees, Gwendolyn Adams, was 15 years old when she first attended Central, and she expressed what I think many students felt. She said, I was of the mindset, I don't want to be here. I don't want to go. So all of the positives that were given to me, they weren't registering at all. And I'm used to all black teachers and people that I know. And I could go to Mrs. Fox. I remember this one teacher. She was just, I loved her to death. Miss Adams stayed the course and graduated in 1958. Another Lyle Davis Jr. recalled receiving a fantastic education at Central, though his previous all-black school had teachers that everyone knew, and because his previous teachers were teachers everyone knew who lived in the community and took an interest in their students. By most accounts, Kansas City did not experience a violent transition from segregation, but over the next 2 decades, population shifts took a toll. The Kansas City, Missouri School District, known as KCMSD, had an 18% minority population in 1954. By the 1970s, that had become 60%. Central High School, where Gwendolyn Anderson and Lyle Jones attended, went from an all-white school prior to Brown to over 97% black by 1962. The school board redrew boundaries that honored the historical black-white border of Troost Avenue that effectively resegregated Central High, among others. Regardless, Central maintained its reputation for academic rigor. Things changed in the 60s and 70s. Overcrowding became a glaring issue at Central High, and student achievement was falling. In 1977, a group of plaintiffs, which included the district, school board, school superintendent, and a number of children, filed a complaint against the state of Missouri, its governor, surrounding suburban districts, and several educational agencies. The complaint alleged that the state government ignored, quote, their affirmative duty to eliminate all vestiges of racial segregation, and as a result encouraged and maintained racial isolation. The goal of the complaint was to produce Kansas City schools that were more attractive to white suburban parents, and thereby desegregate the district while also improving the achievement of children within the schools. After years of changes to the case, 11-year-old Kalima Jenkins became its namesake, and it became known as Missouri versus Jenkins. In this case, U.S. District Judge Russell Clark created a plan to desegregate the Kansas City public schools and ruled that the state of Missouri must pay for 3/4 of the plan, with the Kansas City School District paying 1/4. Clark's plan allowed schools to decide which reform programs would best benefit their students, such as remedial programs, magnet schools, and improved facilities. Clark's plan also implemented a tax increase to help the Kansas City district pay for its share of the plan, although the Supreme Court threw that out and said that the tax had to come from the school board, not from the state. With the influx of money, the Kansas City Public Schools built state-of-the-art facilities, invested in technology, brought the teacher-to-student ratio down, and built or renovated over 60 schools. A major component of the plan was the construction of magnet schools, which are theme-based buildings whose student population is transported to the school from across the area instead of pulling from the local neighborhood. Unfortunately, the results were not what Judge Clark and the district had hoped. Achievement did not rise, and neither did the number of white suburban children attending Kansas City schools. The plan gave $900,000 for advertising and over $6 million for transportation, but the population boost did not materialize. Historian Joshua Dunn, in his book Complex Justice, The Case of Missouri versus Jenkins, explains that the rush of money didn't fix specific problems, like the district's own financial mismanagement and its inability to hire quality superintendents. A majority of white students who did enroll in the district left by the year's end. The reasons were about safety concerns, transportation, and the schools, even with improved facilities, were failing to offer them the better education that they thought their neighborhood suburban schools were offering them. The magnet program, too, failed to help students achieve or reach achievement goals. One black parent and activist, Clinton Adams, told 60 Minutes in 1994 that, quote, "We have not taught kids how to read, write, and count effectively, so how the hell do they think we're going to be able to teach them foreign languages?" The national attention on the district was almost wholly negative. Dunn also pinpointed the black community's opposition to the magnet plan as illogical. Under the quota plan, magnet schools had to adhere to a strict 60-40 ratio, 60% black, 40% white. Because the district couldn't attract white students, black students could not attend the magnet schools even if the school had open seats, because it would throw off the 60-40 balance. When parents voiced concern, one leader of the plan told them simply, quote, "Somebody's kids have to go through the meat grinder." The NAACP and other coalitionary forces joined in their dissent. One from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference said, quote, "Black community is tired. We're fed up, but we're not giving up." Judge Clark eventually relaxed the rigid quota system, but it was too late for buy-in from many black Kansas City parents. In 1995, the U.S. Supreme Court required Judge Clark to begin unraveling the plan for desegregation in its entirety. Justice Clarence Thomas, in his concurring majority opinion, called the Kansas City situation an experiment on young black students, and he fundamentally disagreed with the opinion rendered in Brown versus Board of Education, arguing that, quote, "The idea that black students suffer an unspecified psychological harm from segregation that retards their mental and educational development is just wrong." Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg disagreed. She wrote, quote, "Given the deep and glorious history of segregation in Missouri, to curtail desegregation at this time and in this manner is an action at once too swift and too soon." So what ultimately happened to Linda Brown and the Brown family? 5 years after the U.S. Supreme Court decision, the Reverend Brown moved his family from Topeka to Springfield, Missouri, where he took over as pastor of the popular Benton Avenue African Methodist Church. His daughter Linda enrolled at the racially integrated Central High School in Springfield, from which she graduated with honors in 1961. Sadly, soon after graduation, on June 20th, 1961, the Reverend Brown died of a heart attack while en route to visit family members in Topeka. He was 42 years old. Linda Brown subsequently attended Washburn University and Kansas State University and spent her professional life as a teacher and advocate for equal access to education in Kansas. She died in Topeka on March 25th, 2018 at the age of 75. And what was or is the legacy of desegregation in Missouri? The results were and are complex. Although there was relatively little overt resistance to the legal landscape by the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the case did significantly change the racial landscape in Missouri, especially outside of the major metropolitan areas of St. Louis and Kansas City. But that said, the argument could be made that other social factors, including jobs and housing, had made Missouri schools, especially those in the state's major urban areas, as segregated, if not even more segregated, than they were more than 70 years ago. And black teachers are still underrepresented among the state's teachers, leaving black students with limited opportunities to be taught by teachers who look like they do. There is still much work to be done. Thank you.
Virginia started the DOVE project, the desegregation of Virginia education, and they were just trying to document what happened in their state. And it seems like they went to the most extreme choice. Many schools just closed. I think they were closed for more than a year. Were there any places in Missouri that also went that route?
Of just closing? The black schools, obviously, almost all
Right.
the black schools closed, but I'm not aware, except the ones I talked about that, started and stopped. I would not be surprised, but I haven't found it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Going back to the beginning, 54, 55, how many districts let black parents decide which school their black children would go to? Did most of them opt to keep?
You mean after integration?
Yeah, after desegregation. For example, they had seniors. They've been going to this school their whole life. Were they given the option of letting them finish, let's say at the Douglas School or the Lincoln School?
The short answer is I'm not sure. Again, I think this happened more in outstate Missouri, and I think it happened for the same strategy the NAACP had in the 30s. They couldn't afford to keep those schools going. I think that's actually what happened. But some of these schools, I mentioned, I think Charleston, I can't remember, Fulton didn't integrate its public schools at the elementary level until 1969, 14 years after Brown. And that was not uncommon. There were a number of these small town and rural schools that did not integrate until they just financially could afford not to.
Yeah, but that makes sense, because I think instead of starting at the bottom, you should have started at the top. In other words, at the university level, to where the blacks and whites going to school together, and you're educating the teachers. They're going to go back underneath and start at the bottom. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but that, as Larry will talk about next week, that didn't exactly happen in Missouri. I mean, we did integrate colleges before Brown was the Board of Education.
Well, okay, I'm from California, I know.
I won't hold that against you.
But I've been here 41 years.
Yeah, but that's not 3 generations.
3 generations.
Yeah, you gotta be here 3 generations.
Okay. I concur.
I think, I don't think this thing about the black teachers has been sufficiently explored. I've talked to a lot of these people, and they're still, those who are still alive, are still bitter. And in many cases, they were better prepared because many of these rural schools had teachers who had very little post-secondary. Some didn't have any post-secondary education, whereas most of the black teachers had graduated from Lincoln University. But they lost their jobs, and the black, I know of almost no, outside of St. Louis and Kansas City, black administrators who kept their jobs, as principals or superintendents. And again, that's what a loss that was. 2,300 or so black professionally well-educated teachers. I was doing a project in Kansas City a few years ago about the closing of the black school there, and this elderly woman told me, she said, I don't want to go back to segregation. That was awful. But she said, we lost something when we lost our black schools and our black communities. And she said of those black teachers, she said, they lived in our community, they knew us, they knew our parents, and she said they would not let us fail.
Yep.
I mean, that's pretty hard to argue with.
Yeah, when I was trying to survey as many public colleges and universities in the state, many of the first black students at these schools were black teachers seeking additional certification so they could be competitive with those white teachers.
Yeah.
So many of the, like Southeast Missouri State trumpets 2 people who started
Right.
They were veteran teachers.
Yeah.
Who were trying to get additional certification.
Yeah, and they, as you know, didn't live on campus. They couldn't live on
Yeah.
campus. They lived in the Cape Coral community. Well, it's not depressed us all. Go ahead.
We had one from the computer, virtual world. So you mentioned the kind of earlier desegregation of Catholic schools in St. Louis. Did that translate to Catholic schools around the state as well?
It did in the Diocese of St. Louis.
Okay.
I can attest to that.
Okay.
This was the consequence in 1947 of Archbishop Ritter being appointed the Archbishop for the district. His predecessor, Cardinal Glenn, had been an extreme racist, and much of it was his fear that if they integrated the schools, white parents would stop sending their kids to school. But when Cardinal Ritter came in 1947, he issued a decree that threatened excommunication, which is kind of the big evil of any school or parent who refused to abide by this. And so, I went to a school that had no black. Well, we got integration when a Southern Baptist tried to come to my Catholic school. That's all it is. But the nuns made it very clear, even though there were no black students, that was a real teaching point, a real point of emphasis of racial integration and the need for that. It's easy to say when you don't have any black students. Anybody else?
So how did Fulton and other small schools, drag their feet? In terms of it integrating, I mean, how were they able to just drag their feet?
Because
for
nobody
14
challenged
years?
it.
Yeah.
Nobody challenged it. The high school integrated because there was a man named Jack McBride, just died fairly recently. He's nearly 100. He went to the white high school and refused to leave. He personally integrated the high school. And so when he was there, other black kids started coming. But nobody pressured. And again, I think part of it was the black community had a really pretty nice school. George Washington Carver School that Carver had actually come to Fulton to dedicate. And it was a decent school, and they loved their teachers. As the black schools go, it was one of the better in the state. A nice WPA building. And so I think there was just no force to it. Nobody forced it. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.